Welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast, a podcast from the home of Scrum. In this podcast, we feature professional Scrum trainers and other Scrum practitioners sharing their stories and experiences to help learn from the experience of others. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org. Today's podcast is going to be pretty awesome. I'm excited to be talking to Stefan Wolpers, a PST who's just finished a new book called Scrum Anti-Patterns Guide, which, I had the opportunity to review and to look at when I worked on the forward, and there's some really good stuff in this book, and I think it's going to be incredibly useful in the community and with people that are practicing Scrum. Anyway, but before we talk about that, welcome to the podcast, Stefan.
Dave, thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Very welcome. Before we get started and start talking about anti-patterns, which is why we're here, maybe you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and where you're talking to us from.
Oh, I'm located in Berlin, in Germany, so I can see the Reichstag, so to speak, from my windows here. Well, background, I studied chemistry. I never worked in a laboratory, though. I spent all my professional life in making hardware and software. And like so many other people, Agile found me, a long time ago, so almost 20 years. And I stayed with it ever since.
I'm very fortunate. I'm on one of your lists, I think on LinkedIn, where I get a newsletter every, week of your revelations and experiences. That's why I was so happy that you started writing this book, and it's part of the Professional Scrum series at Addison Wesley. So great. So let's get in it. Let's talk a little bit about anti-patterns, which it's always evil patterns is another way of describing it. I guess there's a lot of Scrum books around, right? There's, I think, well over 100 in English. So I love whether they're about retros, whether they're about, how do you do Scrum? What is Scrum? Pocket guides to Scrum. So what was your motivation for writing this particular Scrum book?
Oh, there was quite a bunch of motivation. First of all, I started the book with writing a series of blog posts, and those were a form of venting my frustration with one of the projects I was working on. So, used my commuting time. We hopped on a train every Monday morning and went to my client. So I used the time productively and wrote about this. And over time, I collected quite a lot of material, and I thought, okay, maybe this is something bigger, because all the books you mentioned are the great books. I have a lot of those in my bookshelf. They all have this idea of, okay, how can we turn this into something amazing? What are best practices? Air quotes here. What shall we do to actually be successful with implementing and using Scrum for the benefit of everyone involved, namely our customers? And I thought, okay, you have a different perspective. You start with, okay, maybe we get good at practicing Scrum by avoiding the usual stupidities that we run into. So this inversion as a learning principle, I would love to claim this for me, but it's been around for a long time. So if you like investing, you certainly have heard of Charlie Munger, and he's a big fan of that. You can't avoid to become a rather decent investor if you just avoid the stupidity of others. And there's so much stuff around. You can learn from almost everyone. So that's the fun part. So I flipped this perspective. It's a bit like a pre-mortem that is also flipping the perspective, or a liberating structure called TRIZ, where you deliberately ask, what can we do to ruin something? And that leads to actually new insight, because you change the perspective. And that was my whole idea. And of course, there's a very selfish motive because writing a book means that you actually have to deal with the content at a different level. You know, churning out a blog post is one thing. Writing a book is something completely different, I can tell you. So it was the first time, major experience, and I'm still recovering from it.
Recovering. I think that's an interesting phrase. You're right. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of editors, both technical and content editors that you've been working with, which is always great. It does make you think, because when you can say something like, oh, X in the book, and then, you know, on a blog post you get away with just saying that. In a book you have to actually put Y. There's a lot more detail, which is great. So if you look at the book, it's actually almost a sort of anti-recipe guide. You know, there's all the chapters of each of the, you know, the key events or the key artifacts in Scrum, and then there's a series of anti-patterns for each one of those. You could almost just dip in and dip out. Was that something you were looking for when you wrote the book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's snackable. So my idea was, okay, maybe someone who's not that experienced with running a daily Scrum or facilitating a daily Scrum, let me put it this way, may be interested in just getting a brief understanding what might go wrong. And so that was my idea. Make it a companion, you know, of everyone. So keep it simple, snackable, easy. You know, it's. I would be surprised if people were to read it from cover to cover. Of course, you can do this, but it's not intended to be that. So it's more kind of a website printed between two four-color covers.
It is. What I thought of it when I looked at it, I remember my mum always, she had one of those recipe card boxes, and she would, like, when she was making a cheese sauce or she was making this, she would bring out one of those little cards and use it. My mum's not I'm English, so obviously cooking isn't in our DNA, as it were. So she'd bring out these little cards, and I felt that was very much what this book was, which was great, because there's many days I need one of those cards when I'm about to enter a sprint review or a sprint planning session. So tell me a little bit about which the most frequent anti-patterns that you saw. I mean, it was inspired from those train journeys to your client. So they're probably the ones that stick in your mind the most, right?
All the anti-patterns you see in the book, I personally experienced one way or another, not just with this one client, but with a lot of other clients. That was my idea. There are some anti-patterns derived from job ads, but that is part of the appendix. But all the other ones I've realized and experienced personally. You know, so it's really a more kind of diary. With a bit of added information. You know, the cool thing is, I mean, if you write a blog post, you can just quickly, you know, you rant about a thing and you have a few lines here and there, and then you're good to go. It's fine. In the book, it's different. You know, so always trying to understand, okay, why are the things the way you observe that? There's always a reason for it. You know, there's always some rationale behind it, very often at a system level or at a personal level. And my idea was, okay, look, how can this be useful? So what I try to help the readers with is actually provide some sort of recipe to get thinking about the situation. Okay, why is it the way it is? And how may the team or even you, the reader, have contributed to the situation? And probably what can we do about it? What might be a first step to actually overcome this situation? And there's significantly more to it than meets the eye at first glance. It's absolutely amazing when you start digging. So that's also the reason why the editing process was so great from my perspective, because it was like you're paying playing ping pong with someone knowledgeable about what you wrote, and they got back to you and said, and this is not working, and this is a contradiction, and it was really the fun part. What anti-patterns are really frequent, I think I try to create a taxonomy of anti-patterns at the meta level, so to speak. And what I found was that there's one category that is really popular with a lot of organizations. And I think you can summarize them with applying practices from a different era to Scrum. It's a classic management tactics that are very, very well suited to undermine Scrum and deprive it of its purpose, so to speak. So normally you might be doing something that resembled Scrum. You do all the events and, you printed new business cards. Now you have a product owner. It's no longer a business analyst, but de facto they're not doing it. So that is certainly a very, very, very large category where you could put a lot of stuff in.
So an example being percentage complete on a task
Yes.
management, all of this sort of those kind of things, status reporting, demos,
totally. Yes.
Detailed analysis, sprints, things like that.
Absolutely. Status reports. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not a fan of status reports. I wrote a lot of those in my past and I hated it all. But there might be a situation where you maybe at the beginning of introducing Scrum to the organization and your stakeholders may not be totally familiar with the new world, and in that situation, I'm completely convinced that you need to bait the hook and feed the fish. The bait needs to be appealing to the fish. And if that, in this case, is a status report, you don't call it status report. You maybe call it's an invitation for the sprint review, right? If you just summarize what's been accomplished, you tell a story, where you have a hero and a villain and how the hero managed to overcome the obstacles and how they lived happily ever after, something along that line. Totally fine. Right? Maybe you don't want to do this for 2 years, but in the beginning, my goodness, if that takes to get your stakeholders to the sprint review, I'm all in. Right? So it's really not black and white. There's a lot of shades of gray, and you have to pick your shade of gray that is compatible with the situation.
It's interesting you talk about status reporting, but the asking why is a really interesting question of your stakeholders, why they want the status, because one of the changes with sprint reviews from a status reporting to actually a positive and a great Scrum experience is the participation by the stakeholders. You expect as much from them as the people that are preparing and creating the review, the Scrum team. So getting that participation, sometimes you can really get at it when you ask that why. And I think you wrote about this, getting into the why is it a status report? Why, what do you need this for? Because you may discover that they need it to feed another engine. So maybe those stakeholders should actually be at the sprint review as well. There may be they may want to contribute and help. So, hang on a minute. Let's find out what you could contribute, where your area is. It can really change the dynamic of everything. But instead of just saying, no, we don't do status reporting and telling everybody, no, stop doing that. The Scrum police are here. You actually lean into it and try to find out the why. And I think that I think super interesting and something I hadn't actually thought that much about until I read your book.
That's the whole idea. It's not a recipe book in the sense of, okay, you read a chapter and then you're good to go and you will never experience a bad sprint review again. I mean, I like to imagine that I would be that good, but I'm definitely not. No, it's more a question of think about this. What of these of this bouquet of thoughts, what the origin or the reason for this behavior is, might apply to your situation. and then pick something and think about, okay, what can we do about it? Maybe take it to the next team retrospective and explain it to your teammates. Folks, I believe our problem with our senior VP who insists on having status report is the following, A, B, and C. What can we do about it? It's not about that you come up with all the solutions immediately by scanning a few pages in this book. I mean, I would be surprised if that would be working, right? Yeah. It's more about changing the perspectives, getting a few new ideas, and then take it to the next level and also gather people, okay, how can we deal with this issue here?
And I really liked the fact that sometimes we have been accused in our community of being the Scrum police, you don't do this, stop doing that, do this. And there's no why, there's no context, there's no something. I'm hoping we never do that. But one thing I really liked about the book is that it really refreshed that whole thinking. It isn't about, yes, there are some things that don't necessarily help at a daily Scrum or sprint review or sprint planning, etc. But instead of instantly just saying no and leaving everybody feeling a little bit incomplete, we lean into them, we focus on them, we dissect them, and we explore them. And then that gives us the power to inspect and adapt and improve in the retro or in other events where we get to improve the process.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah. So interestingly, and I know we haven't got long, so but I do want to touch on one thing. So I really sprint planning. Sprint planning is so many challenges from so many organizations, particularly as they wrestle with that sort of meta problem of old world meets new world. So talk a little bit about sprint planning. What patterns in particular in sprint planning, anti-patterns, sorry, in sprint planning did you discover on your journeys and write about?
I think the most notorious is always that you bring a bunch of work items and then you try to squeeze them under a sprint goal because the Scrum Guide says so. Which of course is not the way it's intended to be. We remember. I mean, it's also the part in the class that takes the most time, the sprint planning, actually. This idea, okay, the product owner brings the business objective to the sprint planning, right? And the team collectively creates a sprint goal, a meaningful sprint goal that aligns with the business objective. Then the developers commit to it. And because they do, they are allowed to pick the work to make this happen. Checks and balances, right? It's a basic principle. It's not that complicated. If you take into consideration that Scrum is about outcome, we want to improve the lives of our customers and contribute to the sustainability of the organization in the process, of course. But it's not about output. I mean, in a complex environment, if you write a bit more code, it doesn't mean that you create more value. We're not assembling fridges here. And if you apply this idea, this dare I say, mental model to the whole challenge, life becomes brighter. Then you can actually start thinking about, okay, maybe that is not a good idea, etc. pp. Right. So that was really, it's the meanest one by all means. So trying to find a sprint goal because the Scrum Guide says so, just to be able to summarize a bunch of unrelated work under one goal, which of course is usually not helpful and not manageable.
Yeah, I think I see that all the time, and it certainly resonated with me. The lack of good sprint goals ultimately are illustrative often of a fundamental problem around work versus value, and getting at the heart of that can suddenly turn work teams into value teams, and I think it's incredibly interesting, all hidden in this very simple little anti-pattern, which is great.
I agree.
So
there's a lot of benefits to cover.
Yeah, I mean, if we can get motivated teams that clearly understand the value that they're trying to reach and empower them and sort of de-shackle them from the challenges of that get in the way of that, I think all goodness happens. And I think that's the sort of theme for the book, right? This is a guide for freeing your teams from those anti-patterns.
I like this picture of breaking shackles. It fits very well.
It is good to break shackles, unless of course you're hanging above a big pit, and then it's good to just hold on to them. So, Stefan, we try to keep these short. We could talk for days on these, and there's an entire book designed to encourage this conversation. So thank you for spending the time today and introducing this book to our listeners.
Thank you very much for having me, Dave. It was a great pleasure.
So thank you everybody for listening. Today we were joined by Stefan Wolpers talking about his new book, which is called Scrum Anti-Patterns Guide. Should be available, but just check Amazon.com or any of your favorite publishers and I'm sure you would find it. It's an absolute interesting book that talks about all those sort of things that you see in your teams that maybe are not necessarily as good as you would like them to be, and gives you some fantastic tips for approaching them and maybe turning that realization into a thing of value. So thanks for joining us today on the Scrum.org community podcast. I was your host, and hopefully you'll be able to join many podcasts in the future. Keep on listening and scrum on.